In our story, Mary pours on Jesus almost a pint of nard perfume that cost what it said is a year's wage for a workman. Well, I looked this up. In 2013, a workman's wage was around $40,000. So I tried to find an equivalent to a liquid that was that pricey, and well, I found out you can buy Spickner today, 12 ounces for $350, and I paid like $15 for this, like, tiny little bit of it. Chanel number 5 is per pint is $3,200. If you want a pint of Chanel number 5. The closest equivalent I could find, the most expensive liquid I could find, was Thailand cobra venom, and that is $19,104. If you ever have a need for Thailand cobra venom, that's what it's going to get you. So there is almost no liquid that I could find that's worth $40,000, let alone perfume. Can you imagine dumping $40,000 of perfume on someone just because you love them? The very idea is ludicrous. It's hilariously generous. Now, the interesting thing about this word hilarious is Paul used it when he says the Lord loves a cheerful giver. The root of hilarious is something like hilar or hilario, which is cheerful. And so this is hilariously generous. This would make a great YouTube video. Can you see this? And all the people reacting to it and all this? Well, it is what happens in our story today, so we have to read it. Let's read it. It's John 12, 1 through 8. 6 days before Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus was, the one Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha was serving them, and Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took a pound of fragrant oil, pure and expensive. It's actually more like a pint, which is sort of like a pound, I guess. Pure and expensive nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped his feet with her hair. So the whole house was filled with the fragrance of the oil. Then one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this fragrant oil sold? It could have been sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor." He didn't say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He was in charge of the money bag and would steal part of what was put into it. So Jesus answered, "Leave her alone. She's kept it for the day of my burial. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." Gospel stories are amazing. What's amazing about them is any child can follow this story. But there's so much else going on in it that's not immediately apparent. They tell so much that scholars are continually studying these stories. It's amazing the way the Gospels are written. The story today is like that. It's very easy to understand. She poured a bunch of perfume on Jesus and the disciples got upset. But it's very deep in its meaning. So we're going to look at this. First, we're going to set the scene, then we're going to look at the characters. So here's the scene. This is a timeline of events. Jesus arrived on Friday evening, and that's when the Sabbath begins, Friday evening. He stayed overnight, had worship on Sunday, all day Sunday. So that night then, Sunday night, when the Sabbath was over, then they were free to do their work, and they threw this dinner for him. And then the next day, on Sundays, when he rode into Jerusalem on that donkey. And the rest of the Gospel of John, which is more than a third of the book, takes place the next week. And then it culminates in his crucifixion and then the Passover. So that's the timeline. Now let's look at the background. Our story starts with the word therefore. The Holman version somehow left that word out. I guess they didn't want to translate it or something. Therefore. What does it mean? I mean, what's it referring to? It has to refer to something that came before it, right? How does it relate to the stories that came before it? So it said therefore. Meanwhile, a warrant had been issued for Jesus' arrest because he just raised Lazarus from the dead and then disappeared out into the wilderness again. So, therefore, means that Jesus had come back to Jerusalem to die. And that's what the therefore is there for. Now let's look at the banquet. You know, a dinner with friends should have been a happy time. You know, it's interesting, because the gospel just says they through this. It was the townspeople, probably, who celebrated the resurrection of Lazarus, and actually in the town was also Simon, who had been cured of a skin disease. And they wanted to thank Jesus for these miracles that he had performed. But there's an undercurrent of tension and fear because they all know what the religious leaders have said. Anybody who knows where Jesus is has to turn him in. Otherwise, you are really liable for the same punishment as Jesus gets. Thrown out of the synagogue, disbarred from God, maybe even killed. They all knew that they were risking themselves. And also, now just imagine, all these people are coming to Jerusalem to purify themselves a week before Passover, and they've all heard of Jesus. He's famous. He's been doing miracles all over the place. They know about this guy. And so here they come. Here's Jesus, famous Jesus. Here's his special disciples. Here's Lazarus, whom he raised from the dead, and probably this Simon as well. This banquet has become a sensation in the area. This is a big deal. All right, that's the background. Now let's look at the characters. Of course, there's Jesus, and he knew he was about to be crucified. He had 1 week left. Had a lot to tell people, his disciples yet. Martha, of course, served. We've heard of that before. That's what Martha does. She serves. That's how she shows her love to Jesus, by doing things for him, for serving meals, for taking care of him. He spent when he was in Jerusalem, he spent his time in Bethany. That was his home away from home, Bethany. And Martha made that home for him, I believe. It takes a lot of work, to make food for that many people. And I suppose all the townswomen were helping with it too. You know how that works. So that was Martha. Then there was Mary. She was there too. Now, anytime you hear of this Mary, she's at Jesus' feet. Interesting. The last time we heard about him, she was like a disciple at his feet learning from him, and Martha got upset with her because she wasn't helping with the cooking and whatever. But that's where we find Martha. She's at Jesus' feet. It's a sign of her devotion to him, her humility, and her love for him. She was one of Jesus' female disciples. He had many. In fact, it says they paid for his board. The wealthy women. And apparently Mary understood Jesus better than the men. And I don't find that real surprising, do you? Okay, now Judas Iscariot. He was there with the other disciples. Now, bear in mind, the disciples didn't know that he was a thief yet, apparently. Apparently, he was the treasurer of their little group. And he must have been capable. And he must have seemed trustworthy. Or they would never have given him the money bag. Hello, who would do that? But Jesus apparently knew what he was like, knew what his character was. It says, he says in John 6, we already studied that a long time ago, but he said, Jesus said, "Didn't I choose you, the 12, yet one of you is a devil?" He was referring to Judas at the time, but of course the disciples didn't know who he was referring to. And this is, of course, John looking back right now, telling us, reminding us who this Judas is. He's very critical of him. Now, what John is doing here is showing us how a person's view of things can be filtered by the way we feel, what we value, and what we think is important. You look at things through that filter, and that's what Judas is doing. Judas has just seen a great act of tender love and sacrifice. And what does he see? he sees he's not getting any money in his pocket. And he sees that he's not going to get any more money from Jesus. So we know that later on, he sells Jesus for some money. That's Judas. And that's what John is showing us. But what's very strange in this story is apparently the disciples are taking a lead from Judas. They're following Judas in criticizing Mary. So Jesus has to rebuke him. All right, so that's the characters. Now let's move on down to verse 3. It's the action that defines the story. It says, "Then Mary took a pound of fragrant oil, pure and expensive nard, and anointed Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair." Of course, so the house was filled with the fragrance of the oil. Now, that oil, what was that stuff? There's two ideas. The ancient Greeks had something they called nard that was actually lavender. I would much prefer that the smell of lavender filled the house than the smell that you smelled on that Kleenex today. But it wasn't very expensive. It was worth a month's wage. This stuff was worth a year's wage. So it was this spikenard. It's carried by donkey and camel train all the way from the Himalayas. Through many hands, everybody getting their part of it, I'm sure. And we know that it smells musky and woody and kind of tones of leather. It's strong, really stinks in concentrated form, as you haven't actually smelled that yet. But that's what was in the house, is this concentrated form. In a very dilute form, it smells quite nice, I think. And it smells remarkably beautiful. I burned some in the sink, and I was just like, oh my, that smells wonderful. Have you smelled aspens in the spring? It's like that. And I walked by some pine trees yesterday when the sun was shining on them and they were wet. And coming off of the old pine trees was this wonderful smell. It was just, you just want to stand there and just be in that smell. Well, that's what this spikenard smells like when it's burned. Just amazing smell. Well, of course, that's why they used it in the temple incense. It's also used to anoint the kings of Egypt. It was part of the incense formula for the temple. It was used for spices for burial. And now, hang on to that thought and remember that John likes to use symbols. So, if you put all this together, what is John telling us about what Mary did? It's a hint he's given us here, because he makes such a big point of this. He's showing us that Mary anointed Jesus as king and priest who's going to sacrifice himself for the sins of the people, a fragrant aroma for the Lord. All of that John is showing us. Where did Mary pour it? There's another conflict in the Gospels here. John says she poured it on his feet. Mark says she poured it on his head. And Matthew copied Mark, saying the same thing. Which is it? Are they contradictory? Well, maybe not. The two Gospels are emphasizing different things. More than likely, she had like almost a pint of this stuff. Too much for pouring on your feet. She probably started at the head and poured it all the way down his body to his feet and ended up his feet. So Mark is emphasizing that Jesus was anointed as king, which is on his head, and John is emphasizing his coming death, as Jesus points out to Mary. So, why does John make a big point of saying the fragrance filled the whole house? That's a tiny little detail. It's one of the indications that this is a first-person account because it's one of those tiny details, you remember. But why would he include it? I mean, there's not much room to write stuff on these scrolls, and so you got to really be precise and don't put in a lot of extra stuff. So obviously this isn't an extra little detail. Why did he include this in the story? It has to further his point. So, you remember the temple? And the glory of the Lord filled the temple with smoke and light. This aroma of incense fills the temple. So that's what John is saying. The aroma of Jesus filled the house. The aroma coming from Jesus. In a number of Old Testament stories, we read about this. Smoke filling the temple. And also John, this is long after Pentecost. He's reminding the readers that Jesus fills the temple of the Holy Spirit, which is our bodies, with the Holy Spirit. Paul wrote this in 2 Corinthians 2:15. To God we are the fragrance of Christ among those who are being saved. Now, that concentrated oil, I put a little bit on my finger when I first got it, this little bottle. It smelled like, And after that, then later on in the day, I took a shower, and I'd been washing my hands, cooking, and on and on and on. At night, I could still smell it on my finger. No matter how many times I washed my hands, that stuff was still there. It smelled good by that time because it was dilute. But then you know that this stuff stayed on Jesus' skin. The whole rest of the week, probably. These people didn't wash all that much. When he was being beat up, put that purple robe on him, he was probably smelling with this perfume. When he's hanging on the cross, he smelled like this, probably. It's pretty amazing. Jesus smelled fragrant all week. You don't even think of this. All that is in that tiny little verse 3. All right, now John seems to be comparing Judas and Mary. First, let's look at what Mary does. After she pours the perfume all over Jesus, she wipes it with her hair. So that doesn't sound like a big deal. But in that culture, it would be like you're at a formal dinner party, and one of the women gets up and approaches the guest of honor and lifts up her skirts. What would everybody think was going on here? That's about what she did. The only other time that this happened was a woman in Galilee who wiped Jesus' feet with her hair, and she was a prostitute. Gives you an idea what Mary just did here. Well, you can see the disciples and Martha just aghast at this. What is this woman doing? This artist, Tissot, he's really studied these characters. You can see Martha in there going, oh my goodness. She's there. Yep, everybody's really shocked. What John is showing us is that Mary has utter humility in Jesus' presence. She loves him regardless. She's absolutely shameless, unembarrassed. She has no thought of holding anything back from him, giving her absolute best of everything to him in worship, even her hair, which the Bible refers to as a woman's glory. Even her glory, her hair. Now, let's look at the other extreme that John shows us. Judas, let's look at him again. John doesn't really like Judas. He doesn't like him one bit. So he reminds us in verse 4 why he hates Judas. He was the one who betrayed Jesus. But look at what Jesus said. No, not Jesus. Look at what Judas says in verse 5. He says, why wasn't this fragrant oil sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? Okay, remove everything you already know about Judas and later on and all this. Apparently, giving to the poor was pretty normal. In fact, when Jesus told Judas to go out and do what he's going to do, the disciples all thought he was going to go give some money to the poor. That's what they did. So that's what he's saying. It sounds reasonable when you look at it like that. I mean, it even sounds practical and prudent, and well, it sounds very pious and very religious. Even the other disciples thought so. But without John's reminder of who Judas was and what he was like, we might be agreeing with him. What was you doing wasting all that money? It could have been done so much good. waste. $400,000 down the drain. Crazy. Woman, what do you think you're doing? And now I'm feeling really guilty. I don't know about you. I am remembering so many times. In fact, it's kind of a pattern in my character, I'm afraid, when I have this exact same attitude towards someone else. Whenever someone's doing something extravagant to honor Jesus, that example is right in me. You see this chair? I found out how much it cost when it was bought. $1,000. And I thought, $1,000 for that chair, and it's hardly ever used? What a waste of money. They should have given it to the poor or something. Exactly the same thing Judas said. It's wrong. It's evil thought. Whoever gave that was trying to honor the Lord. I was critical of one of our summer guests who came up to me all excited about some new stained glass windows that had been put into their church back home. And I thought, oh, what that money could have been used for. I didn't say that to her. That's just evil to have that kind of thought. People were trying to honor the Lord. And the pipe organ in the Lutheran church had just got installed. All that effort that went into that, and it was a community event. And sure enough, in my heart, it's like, did they really need that thing? What a waste of money. That's just evil. Those kind of attitudes. These things, well, I vow to stop it. I'm not going to do that anymore, even though it's ingrained in my character. I used to be called the bummer brother. I don't want to be that way. How about you? Can we have a vow never to do this again? I don't know if you have this attitude or not, but it comes up, I'm sure. It's a sin. It's wrong. Well, why is it wrong? It's because it's not a valid criticism. Could that have perfume provided for a lot of poor people? Yeah, but that's not the point. We have some kind of idea in our head that the Lord's resources are limited. Hello? They're not limited. Just because somebody does something wonderful for the Lord doesn't mean the other thing's not going to happen. It isn't either or. People do these extravagant things to honor the Lord, to demonstrate their good fortune. These are offerings. When we say our tithes and offerings, the tithe is the 10%. I don't know where that came from, probably from the Old Testament. But the offering is just hilariously given. You want to give. It's kind of like the people whose house burned down and people brought their checkbooks. It's the same thing. It's this offering. You just want to. Why it's not valid is that these people who are giving this are not my responsibility. They're not my servants. They're God's servants. I have no right to criticize them. They want to do something to show their love, just like Mary. The problem is that our self-righteous, super-spiritual, fake concern is catching like a virus. I think you've noticed this. It spreads ill will amongst the church and the whole community. Have you noticed that? Someone will do something wonderful, and sure enough, the crabs will come out of the woodwork and complain about this thing and criticize it, and they like to do it in pious tones. I know, because I'm there. You know what it is. You know what that sin is. It's self-righteousness. And it's a cancer among God's people. And it just kills the joy we should have been feeling. So, I need to stop it, and if you have that problem, you do too. But Jesus will have none of it. I love him. What does he say? Leave her alone. Boy, he gets in their faces. He then turns to her with this dear look of love and says, according to Mark, this is what he says, she has done what she could. I should have named the sermon that. She has done what she could. But what has she done? I don't know what she thought she did, but Jesus interprets it. She has kept it for the day of my burial. That shut up the disciples. She has kept it for the day of my burial. I wonder if Mary knew that that's what she was doing. Maybe. She kept this jar of perfume, maybe for a long time. Maybe she meant it for Lazarus and for some reason didn't use it. Maybe she kept it for herself when she died. Maybe it was an heirloom that had just been passed on and nobody used it. We don't know why. But when Jesus said that she had anointed him for his burial, what do you suppose her face looked like? I think she was stricken and sad. And the picture shows it so well. Look at her. Well, now that Jesus has been anointed, it's time for him to claim his rightful place as the King of Israel, the great Messiah who is to come. And tomorrow, Sunday, he will march into Jerusalem, right into the temple. He will claim what's his and clean house, as he had done when John says he started his ministry. No, Jesus is not a tragic victim of this passion drama. No, his father is not some ogre who stands up in heaven sending his son to a cruel death and doing nothing about it. No, Jesus is in charge. He's the sovereign king and priest who voluntarily sacrifices himself for the sins of the people, to save people, to atone for the sins of those who believe in what he's doing. The Gospels all show that Jesus has been in charge from day one, and this was his act of worship, offering himself. We may not know why. There's all kinds of speculations among theologians. Why did he have to do this? We don't know whether it's necessary, but he did. He thought it was necessary, so he did it. And now Jesus is on his way to the cross after Mary anointed him. But for us, I want to back up a little bit. Let's think about what Mary did again. She was hilariously generous. She gladly gave everything she could. You know, there's so many things we meant to do in life but never seemed to do them. Good things that we had intended to do and didn't happen. There are many reasons. Sometimes it doesn't seem prudent. Sometimes it seems like a waste of resources. Sometimes there isn't time to do it. Sometimes it seems like it'd be too dangerous. Sometimes we're afraid or we're concerned about what other people might think. There's so many reasons not to do something. But there's only one reason to do something, and that's because you love the person you're going to do it for. Do we love Jesus like Mary did? There's a big question. Do we love Jesus like Mary did? You know, the lesson here is that we do not have all the time in the world to do something for people that we intend to do. Mary, she just had a week. Jesus just had a week left. If she had put it off, she would have been too late. No matter how much she longed to do something for Jesus, she had to do it now. Is there something you have in your heart? But you have all these reasons not to do it? I don't know what it is. Maybe there's something you have on your heart that you feel you'd love to do for somebody, but, well, I'm telling you, just better go ahead and start now. You don't know how much time you have. You don't know how much time they have. There's no better plan than the first step out. And you never know where that path is going to take you. It'll take you to someplace wonderful because you're doing it for Jesus, whatever this is. One thing I do know, I know God will honor you and he will keep you in it. You know, you can't do everything. You know, you can't do everything. But he will bless you when you do what you can. Be hilariously generous. Start now. Just do it. Amen.